Good morning, Biblionauts, and be ready for seeing me contain myself throughout this whole video as much as I can, because I tend to have very strong reactions when I finish books. Either I hate a book or I love it, and this book I have loved. I loved so much that I'm gonna have to contain myself not to regret having said too many nice things about the book. But honestly, this book is amazing. I came across this book. It was a massive reading gap on my philosophy reading. The medieval era is in general a big reading gap in pretty much any student of philosophy, because it's very easily dismissed. It's considered to be like, the word medieval in itself has like a bad connotation. If you call someone medieval, you're pretty much calling them brutes. And I didn't have that prejudice because a friend of mine who is a lot into medieval philosophy made sure I didn't have that prejudice. But still, because everyone else around in philosophical context has that prejudice, I just didn't come across books. They didn't get talked about, and therefore, I felt like less compelled to read them. On top of that, Boethius, The Consolations of Philosophy, sounds too much like some sort of self-help book that I even like Boethius even has like a similar name to another author I don't remember the name of, but that used to write sort of like pseudo philosophy. So I always dismissed this book, and then David Wiley made a video on his bookshelf essentials dedicated to this book, and it made me reconsider. So thank you, David. I have read this book. I have loved this book. It's a gap, but I didn't know how big as well, because Boethius was much more influential than I knew of. So much more. He is writing this book in prison before being executed. For me, is in some ways, this book is a coming to terms with death for me, in my opinion. It's him talking himself out of all the bullshit, everything that he considers to be bullshit, in order to be ready for the moment in which he will be executed in a brutal manner. We don't know in what way he was executed, but the accounts that we have, they are all very violent. So yeah, he was getting ready for that. But this book is not about him sort of like being afraid of death or considering any other option. This is not Crito either from Plato. It's something else. It's something completely different. And another reason why this book is very important is because it was I believe it was the first book to be translated into the vernacular, which means that it was the first book that was translated into the language that most people spoke, especially people who didn't know how to read. It was the first book to be taught everything. All his works were translated and taught in schools. But this book was the first to be accessible, which is to say, I keep saying that, I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. What that means is that if you were not if you were not a clergyman, if you were a woman, you would not have been able to read at all, because no one would teach you the sacred language of Latin. No one would let you touch the scriptures or anything like that. This would be the only book, if you happen to be a rich, privileged woman, a princess, that if you learn to read in the vernacular, this would be the only book that you would read, the only book that you could have access to. That is insane. That means that, Boethius probably influenced so many other writers. And I can already tell by reading Boethius, I can already see so many themes here. Some of them, like he's super influenced and super, it's definitely talking directly to Aristotle and Plato. So he's definitely influenced, but he's also better than both of them. And that's That's amazing. This is the best philosophical dialogue I have read. Better than any of Plato's dialogues. Better than the Symposium, Crito, and the Apology, which are my three favorite dialogues, along with Dion. Better than all of them. I I can't. I honestly, I'm very surprised at the fact that I came up across this book so late. But there we are, and this is the amazing thing about being an ignorant, that you get to be surprised over and over and over and over. So what happens in this book? What happens in this book is that he's on his cell, ready to be executed, and then he gets a visit. And this visit is an interesting kind. It's for an interesting kind. It's philosophy herself. The embodiment of philosophy visits him in the cell to make sure that there's no self-pity or as I said, bullshit in his own mind before the time of death. That's what's happening here. uh, and the book is written like it's half poetry, half dialogues. So it's actually very funny, because at some point the philosophy says, he asks a question, and philosophy says, "Oh, that has a long answer, and I don't know if you would be able to keep up with it. So I'll sing you a song first. I'll read you a poem, and to ease you into it, and then I'll give you the argument and all the digressions, because they are too many for me to go directly into them. You would not be able to handle that." And I mean, this book is very easy to handle. This is not hard at all. He doing a great job of making every single argument clear. Of course, many of them are flawed. Like, this book is amazing for seeing him trying to make sense of his own beliefs and ideas. God is always in the background. This is not a Christian text. It feels much more philosophical than religious, but God and Christianity are always there to justify. In the ultimate instance, faith is always sort of like the last thing to retreat towards, if at some point there is a certain axiom that needs to be said and not argued about. But he is not axiomatic, he's not dogmatic, he's giving you arguments for everything. Just you have to kind of like come to terms with the fact that he was a Christian, and that played a significant role in the way he is speaking and laying his arguments. And I'm just gonna read you a passage. I haven't chosen a passage, but I do this horrible thing of folding the pages and just writing down like a very quick identifiable thing to know in which page I am. So I'll very quickly find something for you. Um, Conversation, no. Fortune, here, this one. So this is gonna be long. So at the beginning, in the first part of this chapter, philosophy is saying to him, "I have fully diagnosed the cause and nature of your condition. You are wasting away in pining and longing for your former good fortune. It is the loss of which, as your imagination works upon you, has so corrupted your mind. I know the many disguises of that monster, fortune, and the extent to which she seduces with friendship the very people she is striving to cheat, until she overwhelms them with unbearable grief and the suddenness of her desertion." And so here, fortune philosophy is speaking about fortune with as a sort of like a bad girlfriend. She comes to you, she makes you feel comfortable, and just when you think that you can take it for granted, it leaves. Definitely, that speaks to me a lot, because except for my childhood, I consider myself a very lucky person. And I've always thought that at some point I'm gonna have to pay back, and this book is all about that. Like him being executed, is sort of like, your fortune has ended, and you shouldn't be resentful for having to give back. that which was given to you for free. And I think that's very healthy. I, of course, you know, you would take your aunt's stand and be like, I didn't ask to be born, right? But at the end of the day, I personally, that it does speak to me. It does speak to me, that of like not taking your luck for granted, not asking for it either. Like, it's a gift, and whenever it goes, it goes, and that's it. You have to deal with it. It's unpredictable as well, and that's what it's sort of like telling you here. Further ahead, she says, she has caused you, referring to fortune, she has caused you nothing. She has caused you an untold sorrow, when she ought to have been a source of peace. For she has left you, seeing whose constancy, in whose constancy no man can ever trust. Do you really hold dear that kind of happiness which is destined to pass away? Do you really value the presence of fortune when you cannot trust her to stay, and when her departure will plunge you in sorrow? And if it is possible to keep her at will, and if her flight exposes men to ruin, what else is such a fleeting thing except a warning of coming disaster? It will never be sufficient just to notice what is under one's nose. Prudence calculates what the outcome of things will be. Either way, fortune's very mutability deprives her threats of the threats of their terror, and her enticements of their allure, and her enticements of their allure. And last of all, once you have bowed your neck beneath her yoke, you ought to bear with equanimity whatever happens on fortune's playground. If after freely choosing her as the mistress to rule your life, you want to draw up a law to control her coming and going, you will be acting without any justification, and your very impatience will only worsen a lot which you cannot alter. Commit your boat to the winds, and you must sail whichever way they blow. Not just, this is so good. Commit your boat to the winds, and you must sail whichever way they blow. Not just where you want. If you were a farmer who entrusts his seeds to the fields, you would balance the bad years against the good. So now, you have committed yourself to the rule of fortune. You must acquiesce, I don't know what that means, that word there, acquiesce. If you know what it means, put it on the comments, otherwise I'll look it up. You must acquiesce in in her ways. I guess get used to her ways. If you are trying to stop her wheel if you are trying to stop her wheel from turning, you are of all men the most obtuse. For it once begins to stop, it will no longer be the wheel of chance. There you go. And then it goes into a song, a poem, which are all fragmented throughout every single part of this book. And I'll just read you because this one is a short one, and so that you get a sense of what a good poet Boethius is. Some poems in here are going directly into my poetry canon. So good. With dominating hand, but not in this version. As I was reading this, and this is another reason why this is a Penguin favorite for me at the moment, is because it led me into other versions of this, other translations of Boethius. I felt like this was too simplified, and when it came to the poems, I wanted to find other versions, and I searched and I found an audiobook version, and that was all read in like an older form of English. And for the poems specifically, I love the way they were reading them. It's called it's a playlist in Spotify called The Great Audiobooks, and they have like audiobooks for everything. And if you search The Great Audiobooks and the Consolations of Philosophy, you can, as you read the book, you can read the poems first here, and then listen to the poems in the Great Audiobooks, and it's really nice. Also, some they are read by different people, but some of them are really good. So there you go. With domineering hands he moves the turning wheel, like currents in a treacherous bay, swept to and fro. Her ruthless will has just deposed once fearful kings, while trustless still, from low she lifts a conquered head, no cries of misery she hears, no tears she heeds. But steely-hearted laughs at groan her deeds have wrung, such is the game she plays. And so she tests her strength. Of mighty power she makes parade, when one short hour sees happiness from utter desolation grow. And there you go. That's that's his take on fortune, and you can see how he's through sort of like this heteronymous, this second person that he's brought into the scene, philosophy herself, the embodiment of philosophy, how he's talking to himself into accepting his situation, into accepting what's going to happen to him. You've chosen fortune, and fortune has gave you lots of riches. He was very privileged. He was at the very top of like in the scholastic hierarchy. He was always at the very top, and then he was accused of conspiracy and he died. But he was a very fortunate man before that, especially on that era. And he's saying like, you should not regret this for having played a game that benefited you and suddenly it doesn't. You know, it's gambling. If you're a gambling man, sometimes you gotta lose. And that also eases the whole narrative into the next part of the book, which is all about the problem of free will. And they talk about divine foreknowledge. And I don't know if this is the best. I think the first iteration of the problem of free will is in Plato, but here is displayed much more in depth, in my opinion. Although it's of course supported in always like as the idea of divine foreknowledge. Like if God knows everything that is going to happen to you, then how do you have freedom to do anything else? And there's a number of examples given in the book, but the idea is if you know that if someone knows like with absolute certainty that tomorrow you are going to take a train and that train is going to crash, did you ever have, because if you know it today with absolute certainty, then did you ever have any chance to do anything else? To that, philosophy at some point here answers, yeah, but that also applies to the present, right? So you know things now. Is your knowledge of those things affecting them retrospectively, or like it doesn't work that way? And that's a big mistake in the whole argument between free will and agency, determinism, which is it's here for me is very much solved, because I don't think it's a difficult problem. I don't understand why there's a consensus in philosophy and among physics, of course physics, because they think that everything, like many scientists tend to see the world only through their lenses, because they are so specialized. They don't know any other way of framing reality. And in physics you can predict the movement of particles separately, so that technically you could tell where a particle is going to be in a certain moment, if you had a computer to unfold that logarithm, right? However, that they say that if that is the case for a particle, then if we had a computer complex enough, then you would be able to do the same for humans, because we are just particles. I don't think that the sum of a number of things is the same as every single thing together. Like the sum of a number of things makes something else completely different. Just like, if you, like, a country is not just every single person that lives in that country. And it's not just every single piece of sand and soil. It's how all of those things relate to each other. And the way in which they relate to each other creates a certain kind of agency as a community. Just like you have your body is it's a symbiosis. Like there is a number of organisms in your body that act independently, and they relate to each other. And I think that the problem is confusing determinism with predictability. You can predict something, you can know something, but the fact that I know that that car over there is parked doesn't mean that by me knowing that that car has to be parked there. There's a number of things that could happen. All knowledge, in other words, is contingent. And in that sense, my answer and the thing that he fails to respond here, because I mean he does give his own answer, which is that God is ever present and that he just like lays back and watches the whole show without without interfering. He's just aware, can't help but be aware, just like you can help but be aware of the room in which you are. You're not making anything big, you're just receiving that information. Yeah, but for me, like the answer is that our like the knowledge that we have of things is very human. It's very human. It's not so much based on a true understanding of anything, but on repetition, on tradition, on custom. Like the only reason why we know that the sun will rise tomorrow is because it rose every single time, every day of every year since we know from the beginning of history until now. So we expect it to rise tomorrow. But if the sun were not to rise tomorrow, for whatever reason, then we'd find a reason and we'd now call it knowledge again and be like, okay, the sun doesn't always rise. And if after that the sun starts rising again, we just adapt. Science is very trial and error, but a lot of these things come from custom. Many scientific and just many actions, many things that we take for granted are only that because they have happened for long enough for us to expect them to happen again. Repetition again, custom, tradition. That's not the argument that is laid out here. The argument that is laid out here again is that God just actually, I'll just read you the because before that, they of course have to talk about chance and everything, but Boethius is not convinced by the arguments of philosophy about chance. It's like they still seem contradictory and everything. Philosophy is kind of like takes every single angle, and okay, let's conceive that the divine foreknowledge exists. Let's conceive that it doesn't exist. Would anything change anything? And the whole answer is basically no. It's the same, so it doesn't really matter. But of course, since God, in his view, has a divine foreknowledge, the final thing is sort of saying that like if humans and divine present might be compared, just as God sees certain just as you see certain things in your present time, so God sees all things in his eternal present. Which is to say that God sees everything everywhere all at once, like the movie. Past, present, and future time, just like he is omnipresent spatially, he's also omnipresent temporally. And that's kind of like pretty much the very ending of the book. After that, the only thing that's left is to say like, behave and don't be a bad boy, and don't be self-pitiful or start crying about having lost on a game in which you have been winning until this point. So that's Boethius. That's the Consolations of Philosophy. I love this book. This is probably going to become one of my favorite books. One of the best dialogues I have read. One of the most readable books of philosophy because it's playful, because it allows itself to be literature. I feel like one of the biggest problems with philosophy is that it's very much being influenced by German philosophy, which was very military and very dry, and by analytic philosophy, which is philosophers trying to be scientists. And it doesn't work that way. Language is much more artistic than that. But if you look at French philosophy, it becomes much more playful. If you look at Spanish philosophy, it's a whole party. Like philosophers in Spain, Ortega said at some point, he says that a philosopher in Spain has to also be a clown and a bullfighter. Of course, fuck bullfighting and everything, but what he basically meant is, as a philosopher in Spain, you have to be like a spokesperson. You have to the next day go read poems. You have to. It's a person that thinks and writes. That's a philosopher in the Spanish understanding of the word, and that is pretty much sort of like my own aim. You know, there's Spanish philosophers, except for Gustavo Bueno, who kind of had a system. They didn't write systems. They didn't write sort of like, the dash sign is the is always abstracted into the fall, and there's no technicisms. There's no so much how you say, like, specialized words, obscurity, and aims for like understanding the universe as a whole. Although at the moment, my favorite Spanish philosopher alive is making a system, which is a tragedy, but he believes it to be a good decision, and he has some arguments for that. But either way, this book, if you are gonna read any medieval philosophy, I found this to be the most enjoyable that I have read so far. Although I haven't read yet Saint Augustine. I definitely should read Augustine at some point on 2024, but we'll see. There's a lot of things to read. So I hope you enjoyed the review, and definitely check this out. I'll link in the description David Wiley's video. This will be on my essentials, except that I want to only put in essentials books that I have already been with me for at least a year, because otherwise it's not an essential, it's just a book that you really like at the moment. An essential is a book that you have to go back to. I'm sure I will be going back to this because it touches on so many topics, but I'm gonna keep that rule. So there you go. Super recommend today. This book is a massive recommendation, and yeah. As I said, I link in the description David Wiley's channel, and have a nice day. I'll see you on the other side. Thank you, Uktuf.